Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the GenZ Report. Today, we're joined by me, CJ, as well as.
Braden.
He was pointing to you. Hi, I'm Braden.
Oh, I didn't realize that he was pointing in my direction. Oh, I'm Peter, in case you don't know. And
Yes.
And Braden.
Right. And tonight's episode is talking about labor. So, the current event that we have for this week is something that came in today, where it was a Supreme Court ruling that was in relation to a union strike of cement mixing. The ruling came against the union strikers as the with a 8-1 ruling, and it was in the context of the union is now able to be sued by the company that they were striking on for financial damages. This is not a situation of the union being sued for the financial compensation of the loss of labor workforce from the strike, but more so there was a loss of the physical product within the cement that then cost quite a bit of money to the company, which they are now allowed to sue over. And so, to kind of try to put this into another perspective, if let's say you were a union at Starbucks trying your best to unionize, you still have the right to strike, you still have the right to not serve coffee. However, you would not have the right to burn all the coffee beans, the best analogy from my understanding. On this, I find that is personally something that is more reasonable, but I still also get pretty shaky when it comes to anything that can potentially erode union protections going forward. And I am a little bit worried on the justification of, well, this product was damaged due to lack of maintenance, so therefore we're going to try to push that there. But this seems like a fairly considerable ruling, seeming how it skewed so heavily. Braden, do you have any thoughts on the most recent ruling?
So for me, my fears when it comes to this ruling aren't in this specific case itself, but more so for the future. Obviously, this is a radical conservative Supreme Court. They're going to use pretty much whatever they can to push their agenda. And it's obvious that if you look at who's funding them, there definitely is an anti-union agenda. So, I mean, as far as this case goes, yeah, it does seem pretty reasonable, but it's what will this be applied to in the future? Because our justice system is based almost entirely off of judicial precedents. So, what could this lead to? And could this be used to eventually, in the future, push more anti union laws and punish striking workers for going on strike? Because if you look at this, so this case was about essentially the union strikers were accused of wasting cement products and allowing that to not be able to use anymore, which caused a loss for the company. In the future, what sorts of situations could the courts look at and blame the striking workers for a loss of products? So you brought up earlier at a Starbucks, for example, if the employees decide to go on strike, well, what exactly would count as product damage for the future courts? Um, really, if you look at our current court system, it is kind of scary to think about what they could apply that to in the future and what they could consider. I mean, they've already ruled, obviously, 10 plus years ago that corporations count as people. So it's not out of the question for them to take this completely out of context and use it to apply to something that it cannot naturally be applied to.
You brought up a really great point, and that's why this is what I consider to be a slippery slope. It's really no different than the culture wars that are being played here in Florida, where if you take a little, you're going to give away a mile, and that's sort of the same thing here, where the precedent is now being set that you can, crush labor or impede upon a person's First Amendment rights. And so I'm going to pull up the article real quick.
Sure.
Unions are relieved as the Supreme Court leaves the right to strike intact. Now, if you ask me, the idea of even having a highlight, a banner headline that suggests that unions are relieved that the Supreme Court is allowing you to keep your First Amendment right is a very dangerous precedent being set that they even have to go there. You can make the argument, which is somewhat fair, as you alluded to, CJ, about how what they were ruling against is the contamination of the product that labor was apparently engaged in regarding the cement. However, the goal here is to crush labor. I don't think there's any, I don't want to say that there isn't any gray area. I'm sure that there is, but ultimately what they are looking to do is make it as difficult as possible for collective bargaining to take place. They really want to go out of their way to make it so that we cannot, whether it's through Starbucks, whether it's through Amazon, whether it's through what I hope will ultimately be Walmart, the ability to fight back against the corporatocracy. I think every day, as you alluded to, Braden, that this extremely conservative Supreme Court, and again, conservative or not, they're corporate captured at the highest levels. So when their interests are firmly on the side of shareholders and not on the side of labor, I think that above everything else is the major issue here. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, like we had in a previous episode, which, by the way, go check our Federalist Society episode if you haven't already. One of the main things that we highlighted was the amount of judges that have been backed by the Federalist Society and how, again, there are quote unquote conservative, but that tends to end up being whatever the current business interests tend to want. Again, in this case, I do feel that it is something that is more reasonable, just something worth looking at. Something that is more specific to Florida in terms of a more pressing union episode, which we will also have a Florida episode at some point eventually, is more so with the teachers union, as well as I believe it's every single union except police unions are exempt, where instead of being able to take a money out of your paycheck and automatically have that go toward the union, they are now requiring you to pay directly, which adds one more step for people to need to remember to pay their union. And I forget the percentage it needs to go below. I believe it's if it goes below 60% membership for these state-run unions, like again the teachers union, then the state does not need to recognize it as a legitimate union and can crush its power further. So what that can be done in terms of laws about that, I'm not sure. I believe that's also going to be going into the courts. So we will keep an eye on that to see, again, if this is more of a one-off or something that's more pressing. I, again, do not have that much faith within the courts, but the fact that this was a almost unanimous decision does lead me to believe that there is at least some level of argument that it's not going to be the end all of union is dead.
What's interesting for me is that the Supreme Court actually heard this case because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Supreme Court does not have to hear every single case that it's requested to. So for every single case that goes to the Supreme Court, it's because it's gone through the entire court system below it and it's been appealed time after time after time. And then the justices have to actually agree to hear the case. Most of the cases that the Supreme Court is asked to hear end up not being heard at all. So the action to hear this case and make a ruling and a decision on it shows that it was intentional. And that's what's making me think that this will be a slippery slope and there will be more of this to come. Because, as CJ said, this seems like a fairly reasonable case. The employers, look, there was a waste of product, which did lead to a financial loss. So it's a gray area if you want to see the employers as being victims. But this is definitely, in my opinion, going to be used for future cases because if not, why would the Supreme Court agree to hear this? It's not like this was some outrageous case or something that seems at its head to have so much precedence coming forward for it, it seems like really a non-case. So it definitely adds to the uniqueness that this was decided to be heard.
I am going to give a quick rundown of, just so for everybody who needs a synopsis of exactly what this is about. The case was brought by Glacier Northwest, a cement company in Washington State, against the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. We have a very good friend down here who is one of the head of a Teamsters local. After the union's contract had expired and negotiations broke down, the union signaled its members to walk off the job after its drivers had loaded that day's wet concrete into Glacier's delivery trucks. The company sued the union in state court, claiming the trucks had endangered company equipment. Wet concrete, it explained, hardens easily, and the company had to initiate emergency maneuvers to offload the concrete before it destroyed the trucks. But the Washington Supreme Court ruled that Glacier's complaint should have been filed with the National Labor Relations Board. For nearly 70 years, the Supreme Court has said that federal law gives the board the authority to decide labor disputes as long as the conduct is even arguably protected or prohibited under the federal labor law. The business community was gunning for and hoping to eliminate that rule, but it didn't get its way. This was a case of winning a relatively minor battle but losing the war. The High Court did not overturn or otherwise disturb its longstanding rule, giving the NLRB broad authority in labor disputes, leaving unions free to time when they will strike. So, I guess the lesson here is that ultimately, is it a loss to some degree for labor? Yes, to a degree, yes. But in terms of the core principle of being able to collectively bargain and organize, that was left alone. I highly doubt that's the last time that a mega corporation is going to attempt to come after labor, though. I think we could probably agree on that.
Yeah. And to kind of transition a little bit away, which also, happy Pride Month for everyone, because this is our first June 1st episode. But the next thing is I want to talk a little bit on the work environment that has brought up for Gen Z entering the workforce. As one of the oldest members of Gen Z, I do know of people that were in the workforce ahead of time, but a lot of us ended up either entering the workforce if we were getting our college degree a little bit later post-COVID. And for those of you who do not know, my degree is in a business-related field, and as part of that, there were several courses that I took that were management-based, as well as looking at different workplace environments. In pre-COVID, as many are aware, it was a very heavily office-based space, the idea being that you would have massive collaboration between various members coming to meetings, that by having everyone at an office, you can monitor their productivity and make sure that they were not slacking off, and that would allow you to guarantee that you would have steady workplace results. One of the things that was floated at the time and was starting to be implemented in like the fancy smancy tech companies such as Google was results only work environments, as well as trying to have hybrid models when it came to work environments, which were a lot more based off of, hey, here's your task for the week. If you complete your task for the week, congratulations, go home. And if you don't complete your task for the week, then you're not going to be paid for very much longer. And this was something that was known about. This was something that had some level of success and a lot of praise of the flexibility from the employees that were able to experience it, but was absolutely not the norm. COVID, of course, put a wrench into all of that by making it so many companies had to switch to some sort of work from home environment. And while you were having this work from home environment, you saw a lot of different factors that came up. Firstly, you had worker productivity largely increase as people were able to have more time with their family and friends, as well as being able to not have to be commuting to work, led to happier employees, which are always more productive. And then you had the ability for employees to also, because they were always at home, being able to work more within their schedules of what was their peak productive hours and getting things done at faster rates. This has continued to be a trend that's been very useful for jobs that can work from home, while of course being a detriment to jobs that were not able to be done in a remote fashion, specifically around assembly, resources, collecting, and other physical labor jobs. So now, in the current job market, we have had what was this very new and cunning work environment is now accepted as the norm and is becoming very, very popular, not only amongst Gen Z, but workers in general within many different fields. So I want to talk a little bit about how there's been a shift in expectation for things. With Braden, you can start us off with that. Of did you see yourself, I guess, growing up when you were in high school as, hey, I'm going to end up working at an office job? And where has that kind of shifted accordingly since?
I mean, yeah, growing up all throughout middle school, high school, all of that, I definitely saw myself as going into an office job just because that was the only thing I knew. I didn't know that work from home jobs were a thing because obviously they were much smaller at the time. I really didn't have any knowledge of any other type other than you go to the office 9 to 5 and then you come home. But coming out of COVID and seeing all of these remote jobs and obviously now having so many more available, I definitely see myself personally as doing a remote job. So that for me, it's because I want to be able to travel around and not stay in one place for too long. But also because I feel like when it comes to working at home, there is that level of comfort, which creates, honestly, higher levels of happiness in workers, which leads to higher productivity. Like I know that if I were to go into an office and spend 7 or 8 hours straight working, I would definitely burn out. And because of that, I would be stressed and I just would not be able to get as much done as I would be able to get done if I were allowed to stay at home, just because it comes with comfortable surrounding. You have lower pressure, you have lower levels of stress because at the end of the day, you're in your happy place, you're in the place that is your safe zone where you go for peace. And I know for me personally, that's definitely going to raise productivity. And in the long run, that will make me a much better employee than if I were doing the traditional setup.
I definitely agree. I will tell you guys a brief little story. My first job out of college was for the New York Mets when I lived up north. And one of the things that I remember, working in the office environment is that, there's different things that happen over the course of the day. You don't want to just be confined to a chair and a computer screen all day. You also get tired. And one of the things that I ended up doing more often than not with my hour lunch break is I would eat for like 10 minutes and then I would go to my car and I would take a nap. And one thing that I noticed started to become sort of an evolutionary period shortly thereafter was the WeWork office spaces started popping up. Now, a lot of people have difference of opinions as far as whether that's the best work environment to be in, whether it's ping pong tables or lounge couches, or as I saw, the sleeping compartment areas. I think people don't want to be burned out. They don't want to be burned out by their work. They want to work and be productive, but they also want to enjoy their lives. And so, like you said, Braden, if you're talking about the ability to travel, but also not the ability to have to be in the office 24/7. I think if a traditional 40-hour work week and people would want you to be in the office 5 days a week, I think people would be a lot more agreeable to 2 days a week. Just something that gives them the freedom, to not have to be there all the time. And sometimes people feel that they're more productive in the office. Sometimes people feel they're more productive at home. Sometimes people feel they're more productive sitting in a Starbucks with, earphones in and doing work that way. As far as I'm concerned, as long as the work is getting done and it's productive, labor should have the freedom to do what they feel is going to make them the most effective worker, not just what corporate says you have to do it by this book and only this book. I don't think that works for most people. And as COVID showed, workers have a lot more power than they think they do, and they're starting to flex their muscles on it as they should.
Yeah, and something that has been of the more successful companies has been the companies that have continued to be lenient with the positions and remote work for their employees. Another thing that I wanted to also touch on was you were mentioning a 40-hour work week. Now we are continuing to have more attempts, more fluctuations of what works better, where you have one version of the 40-hour work week, which is a 10 hours a day for 4 days a week, which gives people 3 days a weekend, as well as positions that are even pushing for a 32-hour work week, which is also looking to tentatively boost the productivity, as again, people are more productive with the time that they're working. For me personally, I run my own private practice and am able to set my own hours. And what that then means for me is that I have a lot of flexibility, but every hour that I'm not working, I'm absolutely not getting paid for. Every hour that I am working, I'm working in hopes to hopefully lead to some amount of payment. But I also during this year took a job helping with tax prep and taxes. And one of the biggest differences that came for me was I would have hours of sitting and waiting and getting paid for it. And while that was more so because I was on call and in case anyone walked in, that was still a very different change of pace for me during that period of time. So the expansions of the workplace, as well as trying to figure out the new ways to adapt, is something that even employers are trying to look to optimize. Another thing, just in terms of an anecdote, was back in the 80s and 90s, there used to be a known fact that any sort of measures to cut pollution would be something that'd be very intensely costly to the company that was running their factories or facilities, and that it would be basically government overreach to force them to be greener. However, as policies continued to get implemented, these known facts ended up being very wrong, as if you were a great polluter, that meant that you were paying a lot of money in excess energy sorry in excess energy bills and just not being efficient in your workforce. And those companies that had that old way of thinking have mostly phased out as newer, better, more informed ideas have taken place. So that I take a lot of comfort in knowing that while there's kind of a slow push and there is a lot of effort being taken, there is at least always something new that some companies are trying to get an edge on by implementing better things.
Yeah, and we've seen that with working from home, there always was the assumption that if you're not in the office doing the traditional 9 to 5 hour break, that you would not be able to be productive and you would not be getting a lot of work done. And we've seen that when employees are given the chance, if they want to go to remote, they can actually a lot of times be much more productive at home doing remote work than they would be in the office. Just like how we've been looking at going down from a 5 day work week to a 4 day work week. Studies have shown that it was over 90% of companies that did a test trial of a 4 day work week recorded higher levels of productivity and higher levels of work getting completed as opposed to them when they were just doing the traditional 5 day work week. Just because something seems like a bad idea at first in the employment sector doesn't mean that's the way it will be. And actually, a lot of times it ends up being the opposite.
Yeah, and I think you could space it out depending on, how big of an office you have, how many people you really need, and whether or not one would agree to a longer workday of, let's say, 10 hours versus potentially cutting the workday down to 32 hours. Uh, I think it really just depends on the agenda. I don't work 40 hours a week. I work a lot more than that, but it has more to do with the circumstance. I think that that's very important. And I could have a week where I'm working 32 hours, and those are the most productive hours ever. And then I can have a week working 60 and maybe have the same amount. So prioritizing your time, I think, is also very important. Some people are very good at working early in the morning. Others prefer to, burn the midnight oil. Uh, that degree of flexibility, I think, is important, and I think it's the same is true when it comes to figuring out exactly what job is in your best interests. I think very often that's also the thing that is a real miss here, and why I'm a huge advocate for tuition-free public college, tuition-free trade schools, especially. I think people need to find what they're really looking for, and a lot of times, they're either afraid to take that chance, they get stuck in a specific job that is, it's just what's safe for them, and then of course the cost of living, the amount that you're being paid. There's a variety of different factors that one has to consider. But I think improving the workplace environment from a mental and physical health perspective is a huge thing that I don't think we should be underestimating.
Yeah. And another thing, and this is with an anecdote of I've for those who were not around, I spent the last 2 weeks over in London, and it was a very fantastic time. More specifically, overseas in various parts of Europe, but specifically London. And I am, just out of curiosity, been looking at applying for jobs there. And work visa hurdles aside, there has been a lot of things that I've found very interesting with the jobs that I've applied for. First, there hasn't been any positions that have had a full come in every single day. Every single position that I have seen has been in a hybrid fashion, and that is specifically because I'm looking for jobs in London. I know with job searching sites such as Indeed and LinkedIn, you can filter by remote work only types of positions and be able to find something that will work better for you. The other part, of course, specifically with London, and I believe for the majority of Europe, comes in the part of them also offering things such as their paternity care and the rather infamous holiday of having 28 to 30 days guaranteed off, in addition to your bank federal holidays and your weekends, to be able to go and just have that month to do what you want, to go where you wish. And that type of structure is something that I think has been also been fought for a lot more, specifically when it comes to being able to get equal rights to paternity care, allowing for not only pregnant women to be able to take off time, but also the men as well in the family to take off to spend time with their baby. So that I think has also been a growing expectation. Where there has been the most amount of difficulty is there has been pretty big wage stagnation, which has kind of forced a lot of these things like remote work to be more favorable. Because if I cannot afford to be working in the city that I want to live in, then of course I'm going to be having some issues um, with that. But for me, I value being able to have not value getting career skills and being able to get more industry skills within the thing that I am working in, as I also recognize that corporate loyalty to me is going to be minimal to none, with the ability to be terminated relatively fine. And the best way to be able to kind of climb the corporate ladder tends to be by getting job experience and then using that to try to apply for other places. But Braden, you're more on the beginning part of that journey. So do you want to talk about either you or your peers of any other specific expectations that you have for the workplace or things that you're really looking for, or just simply red flags that are now deal breakers for you?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, I'm just entering my junior year of college, so 2 years, and then I'll be officially applying on the job market. And I want to have a good idea for when I go into it. So a lot of times I just scroll through different jobs in my category on sites like Indeed, and I try and scope it out, see what industries are like. But I've been coming up with a list of what I want in a job, and more specifically, what I don't want in a job. And I think that something that I feel going into the job market, and a lot of my peers feel, is that we want jobs that recognize that they're jobs, that won't try and take over our free time, take over our time off. I don't want a job where every single time I go on vacation, they're asking me to take my phone and my computer with me to be ready to do work at a moment's notice. I don't want a job that's going to be impeding on my time spent with my family, with my friends, with my loved ones, or frankly, just with myself chilling and watching Netflix. I want a job that knows at the end of the day, it is just that. It's just a job. I'm going to go there during the work hours, do my work, get my money, but that will be that. And also, something that we've been seeing in Gen Z, and I feel for myself too, is that we're looking to work for companies that are at least somewhat ethically responsible. It's hard to find a big corporation hiring that doesn't do really shady things, but trying to find one that isn't as shady as the others. So I know a lot of people my age are not looking forward and do not plan on going to work for an industry like big pharma or big oil, just because there's really no moral way to swallow that pill unless it's absolutely needed for money. What we want is a corporation or a small company that will treat us like people and not just like working robots, and also doesn't treat the world like it's just there for exploitation.
Absolutely well said. And I was just going to point out from this article, and this is a very important article that was written in SHRM. Is a 32-hour work week feasible in the US? Well, in Canada, an overwhelming majority, 91% of 1,449 senior managers surveyed by Robert Half, favored some type of 4-day work week, although 45% favored a 4-day week with employees working longer 10-hour shifts. Now, another caveat that's important here, which I also think will prove to have will pay some serious dividends going forward, is that almost 60 school districts across Texas are switching to 4-day school weeks, with some of those districts approving the changes to the 2023-24 school year, including one district that serves almost 6,500 students. The strategy aims to prevent teacher burnout, help with recruiting, and improve student attendance rates. Well, you can pretty much shift the language around just a few words, and you get the same thing when it comes to the workforce. People don't want to be burnt out at their jobs. People want to be able to have a certain degree of flexibility, and it improves the overall performance. I think that that's true at any level. And yeah, we are a burnt out culture. And that's something that there are many layers to, but ultimately, I think if we were given greater degrees of flexibility, that would have long-lasting effects. People should enjoy what they do. And I think all too often that's not the case. People really don't enjoy it. And we're seeing, people being willing to walk away from a job. And then you see all of these companies saying, no one wants to work for us. Well, guess what? I don't blame them, because it's very likely that the job that you're offering is not fulfilling. And workers have a right to demand their terms. Representative Mark Takano of California reintroduced his 32-hour work week act to Congress this year. If passed, it would reduce the standard work week from 40 to 32 hours. As you can imagine, it has made very little movement in Congress. Not entirely surprising, if you ask me.
And another thing that I want to touch on with Braden is that when you were talking about things that you want to work for in terms of company, a part of it is that reputation as well. And having a company with a good reputation is not something that has been important not only for the workers themselves, but has also been something that has been implemented by a lot of investors. And that has been a uniquely millennial and Gen Z push. And that is what we now know as ESG investing, or your environmental, social, and governance portion when you are analyzing a stock. Now, as part of my time in university, I did do some stock analytics and was part as well of some competitions. And what was interesting with those stock analytics competitions is that the year before, there was a portion of, hey, how much research did you have on the ESG rating of this company that you were given? That portion was 5% of your overall score the year previous and have jumped to 20% of your overall score in the year that we did it. And that reason is because, again, our generation does not want to be associated with these companies with worse press. We also, as investors, do not want to be investing in a company that is going to eat itself from the inside. One of the bigger pop culture companies that have really, really destroyed themselves has been the company of Activision Blizzard, specifically under the abysmal management of Body Cottage, which not only has eroded the company values of Blizzard with doing things that allowed for a workplace culture of massive sexual harassment and a frat boy culture, but also so terribly mismanaged his teams that the big upcoming sequel of one of the best game of the year contenders from the year of 2016, Overwatch to Overwatch 2, they ended up having to scrap the entire point of creating the sequel due to the mismanagement of that CEO. So there's being more of an eyeglass on what does this upper management do, and more of an eyeglass on, hey, is this company making profit now? But also, is this company going to be sustainable going in the future? Now, there's still, of course, issues when it comes to expectations of endless profit and endless, sales numbers going up, endless users going up. But the way that a company conducts itself is something that is being a much greater point. The last part that I'll say is, of course, with Disney now having to feel the wrath of many lawsuits from DeSantis back here in Florida, as a result of Disney trying to stand up for the pressures from both externally and internally within the company during the implementation of the Don't Say Gay bill. So it is absolutely something that you are not alone with when it comes to being a force of making these companies actually need to at least outwardly show some semblance of caring going forward to get the best talent.
That's where collective bargaining really plays a big role. Workers need to be banding together regularly, and learning how to do that when you're young really does make a difference. And we can see just the far-reaching effects with Starbucks alone that it's had. But it also means that a lot of these corporations are going to fight even harder against us. And unfortunately, they have the courts, they have the legislative and executive branch. We're in for a very long battle. But I think, as I like to say, kind of like with the evolution, when I first really started getting into things politically during, Bernie's initial run in the summer of 2015, a lot of us were wet behind the ears. But now a lot of us, even those that are young, are what I call seasoned veterans. You have experience now. You know a lot more of how the game is played. And you can see when they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes, and you're breaking right through it saying, nope, you're not fooling me. I know my worth. I know that I bring more to this company than you're giving me. And if you are not willing to properly compensate me and make the environment worthy of having me here, then I'm going to go look somewhere else for that. And that's the only way to be as far as I'm concerned. Know your worth and fight for it.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely true with workers. Um, com- Companies and corporations need workers a lot more than workers need companies and corporations. We have, and I say we like I'm in the job field, which I'm not yet, but we as a collective, as a society, have so much unused power and unused potential. And there's a reason that, as we were talking about earlier, the Supreme Court is hearing these cases, why DeSantis in Florida is signing so many anti union bills, because the whole point is to try and kick us when we're down, because right now the labor movement is so down compared to how it used to be. But as long as we overcome this hurdle, look, if you want a good job with a good salary, benefits, protections, the way to go is a union. Even if you're just working part time, like you're a Starbucks employee and you're in one of the new shops that has been unionizing, this is the way to protect you as a worker and also protect you as an individual from harmful, toxic employers.
Yeah, and as we bring the conversation full circle, for those of you who don't know, I am in commercial real estate, and I pay very close attention to a lot of the trends and things that are going on. And there's no question that there is uh, you want to call it a recession or even a crash that is coming. Commercial office space is not being filled. In fact, I think it was in Los Angeles, if I remember reading correctly, that it's like over 30% of the buildings are unoccupied now. And that's a big problem. Uh, Now, what are they going to do about it? I think is, a big question here. What would you guys like to see happen? Instead of, constantly trying to figure out ways to get people back into the workspace, which is what they're trying to do. I don't know how the hell they think they're going to do that. Uh, how would you guys see uh, better usage of these office spaces that are no longer being prioritized?
Um, so for me, the best thing that we can be doing when it comes to office space is, like I've said in a previous in a previous podcast, rather, is that I am much more in favor of mixed zoning, of being able to allow for very loose restrictions. I think that there is exemptions that can be made for specifically the industrial sector. If you're creating mass pollutants, if you're creating like energy, that still makes sense to be zoned off. But when it comes to commercial versus real estate zoning, I think that they could pretty well be mixed together in some way versus the suburbs. Again, using my example of being able to be in London, while I was in the city, there were a lot of places and restaurants and things that you could purchase and buy, as well as many residential areas literally across the street from each other. And this was in the context of, hey, the city being very walkable and still being very spread out when it came to the public transit in that area. So if you want to be able to find space, I think that being able to convert at least some of it toward residential would be good, as well as seeing if there's anything that could be as well in shops. But for all the office space that is there, it is going to definitely take a lot of money to refurbish, which is going to definitely cause, I think, a slow if there is going to be that bad a collapse as you predict.
Yeah, for me, there's what I'd like to see happen and what I think will actually happen. So, my big thing is affordable housing. I'd like to see the space turned into affordable housing, especially since we have such a crisis in this country. First of all, we have almost a million homeless people inside of the United States, and we have so many more who can't afford housing. But that's going to take a lot of money to, as CJ said, refurbish these places into affordable housing. It probably in the short term will not create that much profit. So it's not what I expect to see at all. What I think will happen is just other ways that these spaces can be used for corporate reasons, even if that's shifting from some type of an office to some type of other corporate setting. In the end, in my opinion, the bottom line will always be profit. So that's what I'm personally looking for in these spaces. Not what I'm personally wanting, but what I think that the people who own, operate, and manage these properties are wanting.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the same boat. I think that you have choices from an investor perspective. If you're not getting any use out of your property, then you're just bleeding money, like left and right. And if that's the case, why not do something about housing? Especially in a city like Los Angeles, where that would make a lot of sense. There is a massive housing crisis in LA, and that's where a significant portion of a lot of these office buildings are not being utilized. Now, I'm not saying that it won't be a sizable task in order to refurbish these properties properly so that it is a living space. But I will tell you, there was a space that I saw down in Miami about 2 months ago that the way it is designed, it is an office building. However, the the architectural structure of the building is designed so that if things do not work out and they have to ultimately convert it, it can easily be converted into an apartment. They were designed specifically with that in mind. It had to be. If the way that you saw they were set up, you would think, oh, this is like an apartment building. Oh, it's an office building. Well, they were definitely making sure that they covered all contingencies if something were to go wrong. And I do think that that is something that you will see in the future. Definitely mixed use space. That is a huge, huge thing. As we talked about, people not wanting to commute to work. There's always this argument about whether or not you should be compensated for the commute, which is crazy, but you're on company time when you're going to and from your job. If you were able to work, let's say, in a mixed use building where you lived upstairs and the commercial office space is on the ground floor, let's say, I think a lot of people would find that a hell of a lot more appealing. And if you felt that you needed to go upstairs for 3 hours or whatever and get work done there, then so be it. But that is something I also think is going to be huge. And if we're going to bring it all the way full circle regarding the environment, that would also cut back a huge amount on the carbon footprint. I think that would help a lot as well.
Yeah. And we did go over it a little bit more in terms of mixed zoning and our episode with gentrification and rising costs. So if you want to check out that episode, you're more than welcome to after we end here. But to wrap it up, to bring us back to, again, labor, is I feel that the biggest takeaways is that our generation has seen the stagnation of wages, and we know what we are being offered. And if the wages are not going to be going up, which they are increasing ever so slightly, then we are going to be instead looking for better working conditions. And that has been the upward trend and suggestion. So I personally, when it comes to work, am someone who is fortunate enough to be educated in a field that is very desirable by employers that should be able to compensate me well going forward. So I will be fine. But even then, my expectations and the things that I am requesting are, I believe, higher and have continued to rise over the past few years. The overall working conditions, I do believe, will continue to get better as there is a greater unionization work, as well as just simply using the internet, allowing to know, hey, here's what it's like in this country, here's what it's like in this state, being able to have better connections with more people worldwide, giving us a better perspective of what these same corporations are doing to someone in Florida versus California versus England versus South Africa, that there are variants, and trying to push for that together as well, being like, well, they can do it here. Well, let's see if we can do it here. So I'm very optimistic going forward. Of course, the laws and how that might be gutted, I think, is going to be problematic. But I do think that also especially in blue states in the United States, things will just continue to get better and better and better. Braden, any closing thoughts?
Yeah. My plan going forward, like I said, I want to do remote work, but is to move abroad and move to a different country. So for me, I'm kind of like watching this in the rearview mirror, being like, have fun dealing with this. But yeah, in the long run, I think if we're using history as a precedent, every decade working conditions do get better. Right now, there is a special employers and corporations. They've become really good in the past few years at figuring out how to use money to get the political system to work in their way. So right now there are additional threats, but at the same time, I think if there is strong unity among workers, especially in the form of strong unions, then this isn't anything that workers can overcome. Because the good thing about the way our economic system is structured is that even though it seems like it is these corporations and executives that hold all of the power, that's not the way it is. In the end, it's workers. There's no corporation that can function without workers. So the power is in our hands. It's just how are we going to use it? And how are we going to overcome the obstacles that are being placed before us right now at this moment?
I definitely agree. And the obstacles will get harder to fight. And the reason they'll get harder is because the people that have been used to getting away with what they've been getting away with, a shareholder, Wall Street driven economy, Silicon Valley driven economy, they've been able to run roughshod over working people for a long time. But a lot of working people are starting to get their sea legs. And as a result, their arguments do not hold water. People know they're being exploited, and no amount of polish will cover that turd that is anti labor capitalism. So that is where the tide will turn. It's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of, laser like focus because there's a lot of distractions out there. Don't allow yourself to be distracted, and keep recognizing your power. That's what we do, and that's why our channel is about transforming politics into service. So appreciate what you guys are doing, and appreciate all the hard work that we have to go through in order to get some semblance of the type of change that at least can make our lives livable, because right now they're not. And we got a lot of work ahead of us. So let's keep fighting the good fight.
With that being said, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we will see you next week at our 9 o'clock time. See you soon.
Have a good night, everybody.